Introduction. Hello everyone. Today we will introduce a lesser-known figure in Japanese history. He was an important political leader in Japan before World War II, serving as Prime Minister 3 times between 1937 and 1941. During his first term as Prime Minister in 1937, he initiated the Second Sino-Japanese War. In his second cabinet in 1940, he forced all political parties to voluntarily dissolve, significantly setting back Japan's parliamentary politics. He concluded the tripartite pact between Japan, Germany, and Italy, and further signed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact in 1941. Taking advantage of the outbreak of war between Germany and the Soviet Union, he decided to advance into what was then French Indochina, present-day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. During his third cabinet in 1941, he began the occupation of French Indochina. In response, President Roosevelt, who had been seeking to gain influence in Southeast Asia, decided to impose a complete oil embargo on Japan, triggering the outbreak of the Pacific War. After hearing this, who do you think this person might be? Those of you living outside Japan probably thought of Tojo Hideki. However, that is not the case. The man who carried out these actions was Konoe Fumimaro, born in Tokyo in 1891 into a noble family. The Konoe family was one of Japan's most prominent aristocratic houses, and Konoe Fumimaro received an elite education from a young age, entering politics at an early age. He held the ideal of countering the colonial rule of Western powers and aiming for the independence and prosperity of Asia. However, his choice of military force and dictatorial political methods as a means to realize that ideal led Japan down the path to destruction. Konoe Fumimaro was deeply involved in a series of critical decisions leading up to the Pacific War, including the outbreak of the Sino-Japanese War, the conclusion of the Tripartite Pact, and the invasion of French Indochina. However, in the post-war Western historical narrative, these decisions are primarily attributed to Tojo Hideki. Indeed, Tojo was the prime minister who decided on the attack on Pearl Harbor and was a representative militarist during wartime Japan. However, the role played by Konoe Fumimaro in the process of Japan's march towards war was by no means small. Konoe, while concerned about the expansion of the war, eventually accepted the military's assertions and steered towards war. Suspending the function of the Diet and aiming to establish a nationalistic new order weakened democratic politics, allowing the military to run amok. On the other hand, Konoe also sought peace when he felt the war had reached an impasse, and cannot be simply labeled a militarist. After the war, Konoe, accused of being a Class A war criminal, took his own life before standing trial. His true intentions remain a mystery to this day.
I am Konoe Fumimaro, the man who served 3 times as Prime Minister of Japan. In the West, my existence is largely overshadowed by Tojo Hideki. However, it was I who greatly influenced the fate of Japan from the 1930s to the 1940s. I was born in 1891 into a prominent noble family in Tokyo. From a young age, I received an excellent education and became well versed in world affairs. Eventually, I entered politics and became concerned about the future of Japan and the world. At that time, Japan aimed to counter the colonial rule of Western powers and become the leader of Asia. I agreed with that ideal. However, in reality, the military was becoming more prominent, and Japan was becoming increasingly isolated internationally. In 1937, I became Prime Minister for the first time. Immediately after, the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out. Originally, I did not desire war. However, the situation escalated rapidly, and I was unable to contain the expansion of the war. The world situation at that time was complex. In Germany, the Nazi Party was on the rise, and Hitler was building a dictatorship. In Italy, Mussolini advocated totalitarianism and strengthened military power. Within Japan, there was no shortage of those who sympathized with these European movements. Particularly within the army, there was a growing belief that the nation should be reformed under military leadership to build a strong Japan to counter the West. Initially, I was wary of this. However, I gradually became unable to suppress the military's demands. In 1940, I formed my second cabinet. At this time, I made a painful decision. I forced the dissolution of all domestic political parties, effectively suspending parliamentary democracy. This established a system in which the entire nation could be directed towards war under a single organization, the Taisei Yokusankai. In retrospect, this decision may have been the first step towards Japan's destruction. Around the same time, alliances with Germany and Italy were strengthened. The Tripartite Pact was concluded. Furthermore, in 1941, a neutrality pact was signed with the Soviet Union, gaining a foothold for advancing into Southeast Asia. Later, while fearing provocation of the United States, I was overridden by strong demands from the military and decided to occupy French Indochina. This series of actions heightened the sense of crisis in President Roosevelt of the United States. Sanctions against Japan were strengthened, and a complete embargo on oil exports was implemented. Cut off from oil, a matter of life and death for Japan, we were forced to go to war. I resigned as Prime Minister, pinning my last hopes on avoiding war. The succeeding Tojo cabinet entered the Pacific War after negotiations with the United States broke down. The attack on Pearl Harbor. While Prime Minister, Tojo Hidechi bears direct responsibility for starting the war. I, Konoe Fumimaro, cannot escape responsibility for the process leading to the war. Initially, the war situation saw a series of victories for the Japanese military. However, the American counterattack soon began. With the defeat at the Battle of Midway, Japan was put on the defensive. As the war situation deteriorated, war weariness spread domestically. Even after leaving office, I continued to seek the possibility of peace. However, I was met with strong opposition from the military and it was not realized. I could only watch helplessly as Japan sank deeper into the quagmire of war. And in 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet Union's entry into the war, Japan met defeat. In the Tokyo trials, my name was also raised as a Class A war criminal. However, I was not brought to trial. Feeling responsible, I took poison and took my own life. I will not state here my reasons for taking my life. However, my actions were the result of anguish over the contradiction between my ideals and my actions. While advocating for the independence and prosperity of Asia, I ended up leading the nation to destruction by becoming mired in the quagmire of war. I can no longer say that my words and deeds were correct. However, I want you to understand that there was a deep love for my homeland, Japan. I may have been a foolish politician. However, it was the result of agonizing over the future of Japan in my own way.
Conclusion. What are your thoughts after hearing this story? Putting aside the historical evaluation, knowing the inner thoughts of Konoe Fumimaro as a person should help in understanding the multifaceted nature of pre-war Japan. In the West, it is depicted as if the dictator, Tojo Hidechi, advocated militarism and led Japan to war, but history is not moved by a single person. Without a figure like Konoe Fumimaro, Japan's path might have been different. At the same time, however, it is also true that Konoe alone could not have stopped the flow towards war. Behind Japan's rush to war were the complex domestic political situation and the heightening of international tensions. The rise of the military, the spirit of opposition to Western powers, the desire for independence of Asian countries. These various factors intertwined, and Japan walked the path to war. the words and deeds of Konoe Fumimaro may symbolize the anguish of an intellectual tossed about by the waves of such an era. Caught between ideals and reality, he was forced to make difficult choices. While his choices were not always correct, it is certain that he had his own intentions and beliefs. It is said that history is driven not by individuals, but by the tides of the times. At the same time, however, it is also true that the decisions of individuals like Konoe Fumimaro greatly changed the course of history. It is no exaggeration to say that his every word and deed determined the fate of pre-war Japan. Through the figure of Konoe Fumimaro, I would like you to feel the complexity of history and the magnitude of the role of the individual. There are many lessons to be learned from history, but as a prerequisite, it is most important to understand the multifaceted nature of the people in history. Rather than focusing solely on the figure of Tojo Hidechi, we should also turn our attention to the anguish of intellectuals like Konoe Fumimaro. By doing so, a more three-dimensional picture of pre-war Japan should emerge. This has been the story of Konoe Fumimaro. I hope it will be an opportunity to re-examine the reality of pre-war Japan through the eyes of Konoe. To learn the lessons of history and build a better future, let us consider what each of us can do. Thank you for watching. I would be happy if you could share your thoughts in the comments section. See you in the next video.